Perfect. Okay. So joining us today is Bob Stevens. Bob is a very dynamic individual. He is a son of Missouri, born in Springfield. Brings just a tremendous amount of experience in HR. So today we'll be talking about the world of human resources, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, especially these days as we look at the popular media, popular press, lots of issues and challenges with businesses, HR issues, HR compliance. So we'll be getting into some of those discussions, and for especially small, mid-sized businesses, to understand what specific steps you can take. By the end of today's conversation, hopefully you'll have a handful of specific steps that you can take to apply to your business to mitigate potential risks. So Bob, as I said, he's got tremendous amount of experience, 35 years of HR experience, because he loves complicated situations. He was on the council at the city of Springfield for 7 years, 5 years as the mayor. So lots of experience in the public sector. He's also had 8 years of experience. He's got 12 years of experience working with small, mid-sized businesses as a consultant. So just tremendous amount of insights that he'll be able to share with you today. Couple of quick housekeeping notes before we give the baton over to Bob. In front of all of you, you should have a review, a very short survey. If you can just take a few minutes to fill that out as the conversation wraps up today. We critically need your feedback on ways in which we can make our, give me 1 second, I'm seeing. We need your feedback to make sure that we're adapting to your feedback, that we're listening, learning. If you have thoughts on other speakers you'd like to see or hear, please do let us know. We will take your feedback and try to incorporate a more powerful programming next time. So please do that. Also encourage you to visit a portal that's been created for our small, mid-sized businesses in our communities called business911.org. Today's conversation is all about HR, talent, recruitment. You can go to this site. It's free to use for our small community members. If you're looking to post a job, you can do that online there as well. So hopefully it's a really simple tool for some of our local businesses. With that, I will pause and I'm going to hand the baton over to Mr. Stevens. And let me just get our computer set up here. And all right, here we go.
Thank you, Rishu. Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank Rishu for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here today as part of this Business Speaker Series. I also understand that even though I'm here at the hospital in Aurora, I'm also being streamed to other communities around the Southwest Missouri area. So I want to say hello and thank you all for being here as well. Our world, whether it be a business world, political world, or the educational world, is becoming increasingly contentious and volatile, hence the title of our topic today. In today's webinar, we're going to look at some of the structural issues that we have to deal with in our organizations and ways in which we can navigate some of the more common problems. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at 3 environments that are common to all organizations. The first is the people environment, the second is the legal environment, and the third is the management environment. Now, I know you all came to this webinar with certain expectations, as did I as the facilitator, and my expectations are that we will attempt to align the topics that we talk about today in such a way that it provides you with tools that you could take home or to your organization and immediately put to use. And my second expectation is that hopefully we will focus on the big picture, which will give you the opportunity to move down to dealing with the effective details of your job, so forth. There we go. I truly believe that we are in a period of transition. In fact, the world always changes, but it seems to be just changing at a little more rapid rate in these days than it has in the past. Whether that means I'm just getting old and don't recognize that it's the same rate of change, or I just can't cope with it, I don't know. But whether that transition is positive or negative, I think remains to be seen. And this transition spans all the world's environment that we have represented here, whether it be business, whether it be education, whether it be medical, consulting, and so forth. Um, the gentleman in this array of photos, go ahead and hit, there we go. You have four gentlemen here. You've got Pope Francis, you've got President Trump, you've got former Governor Greitens, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Greene County, we also have Bob Certain photo there, the presiding commissioner of Greene County. And we will talk about what these gentlemen have in common just a little bit later in the program. There are a couple of things that I think are truisms that we really need to keep in mind as we go through this webinar, and and they apply to whatever environment that we exist in. First of all, we have what is called the constraint triangle, and for any project or any environment, whether it be volatile or passive, this applies. And for example, if you want something that is good and you want it quick, it's probably not going to be cheap. If you want something shipped to you from Amazon and you do it through FedEx or something, it's going to cost more than if it goes regular freight and so forth. Same thing if you want it quick and cheap, the good part is a little doubtful. Somebody may slapdash something together for you, but it may not be what you have in mind and so forth. So just keep in mind those three things: good, quick, cheap, and basically you get to pick any two of them. The other truism that I'd like to talk about is this one, where it's about the structure of an organization. And if you just take a look at your slides there, every organization is perfectly structured to get the results that it does. If something is not working right, if you are, for example, in a business that makes aluminum storm doors and you're coming out with a very high waste rate at the end, maybe 20% of the doors aren't able to be sold because they've been bent or damaged somehow in manufacturing. You need to look at the structure that led to that aluminum door coming off the end of the line. The same thing with education. If your students aren't attaining, certain levels of learning, it may not be the instructor, it may not be the principal, it may be something else within their environment that is preventing that from happening. But every organization is pretty much structured to get the results that it does. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit, just for a minute or two, about a definition of management. This was the definition that was prevalent when I first got into the business world back in the late 70s, 1980s. Yeah, you could tell by the hair I am that old. But let's take a look at this definition. The old definition is getting things done through the 4 M's. And as I put these 4 M's up there, I would sort of expect to, get a couple of grins out there, especially from the first one. Getting things done through the 4 M's, and those 4 M's are men, methods, materials, and machinery. This was the common definition back in the, say, 40s and 50s and even into the 60s. And the one, of course, that stands out is the fact that, women were not as prevalent in the workforce, and it was anticipated that men would be in all the positions and so forth. The new definition that we are using, or that gets used by a lot of HR people around the country now, deals with achieving organizational goals through the effective deployment of the workforce, your processes and technology, your inventory, and your capital resources. But all of that is done within certain legal, social, and cultural parameters. There are things going on in our greater society that have an impact on our work world, and that falls into the new definition of management. And it's necessary to recognize that those legal, social, and cultural parameters are out there and that we have to operate under them. In terms of coming changes, there are a number of them. We have increased automation coming our way, demographic changes. We've got a gentleman out in the audience, Greg Burroughs, who heads up a Give 5 program, which is where shows people who have retired how they can continue to be valuable by volunteering within their communities and so forth. And as they retire, as boomers retire, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for them to be helpful. And also there are going to be a number of engineering changes. We're already hearing about driverless cars, driverless vehicles, packages being delivered by drones and so forth. And these are the kind of changes that we're going to be seeing. Now, currently, one of the issues we deal with, not only here in Southwest Missouri, but also throughout the entire United States, is the mismatch of jobs that are open and the job skills that are available to fill those jobs. Organizations are finding it increasingly difficult to hire and retain employees. If you take a look at, there's a slide there entitled "The Dollar Cost of Turnover." You know, this gives you some idea. A lot of organizations don't really understand what the cost of turnover is to their organization. But if you think about it, as Rishu gets to that slide, the money you have to spend in recruiting, whether that be an online ad, whether it be in your local newspaper, whether it be buying little, what I call the real estate signs that you stick out in the yard, say now hiring. There's one company in Springfield that on their marquee just advertises constantly interviews Thursday at 5 p.m. So if you're looking for a position, they will interview anybody that walks in on Thursday at 5 p.m. and so forth. So you've got those costs in there. Then when you pull somebody off their particular job, whether it be the manager, the supervisor, the owner, to conduct the interview, say it's a 30-minute interview, there is 30 minutes of time where they are not spending their efforts, you know, in terms of managing the company, organizing, checking inventory, things of that nature. Also, once you have hired an individual, there is a requirement, you know, by most companies that they go through some type of orientation and training. If someone hired me to hypothetically fry hamburgers at McDonald's, I would have to have some training time because while I know how to cook hamburgers and I know how to make French fries, I don't know the McDonald's way of doing that. And so somebody's going to get pulled off their job to spend time with me, teaching me how to do the apple turnovers and how to clean the ice cream machine at McDonald's and so forth. And so you've got that lost production by the trainer. And then as I first get started over a period of time, I'm not going to be as productive as I am after, say, a year there. And so there's very little or no production by a new employee. And then if that employee leaves, we have to turn around and do it all over again. And this is what adds to that continuing rollover cost of turnover. And let's also talk a little bit about the larger context of the problems. There are demographic factors, societal factors, and legal factors, and I mentioned those earlier today. But if you take a look at your handout there in front of you, in terms of the demographic factors, the workforce is changing. There's no doubt about that. For example, the workforce is getting older. You have more people that look like me out there in the workforce, and fewer young people are entering the workforce. In the year 2000, the retirement ratio was 1.4 to 1. That meant for every one person coming into the workforce, 1.4 people, you know, were going out of the workforce. Also, in some areas, you have a racial situation going on that in some areas, for example, out in the Pacific Northwest, some of your minority populations are actually the majority. You're seeing communities out in Oregon and Washington that have a much higher Asian population than they do a white population and so forth. Same thing happens in southwest part of the United States where you have a larger number of Hispanics in some communities. Then language is another issue that organizations are dealing with as more and more people come into the workforce. There are companies that are begging for bilingual supervisors, people who could talk one or two, three languages. Um, I live in Springfield, Missouri. There's a lady who works for the Springfield school system, and she deals with all of the students who come into the school system whose primary language is other than English. And I was talking to her a couple of 3 weeks ago as I prepared for this, and she said right now in the Springfield school system, there are 48 different languages that children speak as their primary language coming into the school system. So that creates innumerable issues for the local school system to deal with. And then there's a thing called jargon, which is basically the language of your particular organization. There is terminology that is used in the medical field that is far removed from terminology that I would use in the HR field. Same thing in terms of education. And as people come into those areas, those environments to work, they have to learn the jargon as well as, the job itself. We talked about the workforce shrinking a little bit. Controversy does rage about that. There are some studies out there that indicate that the millennial generation may actually wind up being as large, if not larger, than the baby boomer generation. In the Springfield MSA, or the Metropolitan Statistical Area, our unemployment rate is right now at 3.1. All the time I was in HR, anything at 5% was considered full employment. And now we've got unemployment at 3.1%. And actually, just as a bit of interest, that is up from 2.1% several months ago, and that was the lowest since October of 1999. So there are plenty of jobs out there, but as I said earlier, there's a mismatch between the job requirements and the job skills that people have who are available to work. There's also the thing going on of boomer retirements. The baby boomers are beginning to retire. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 1.4 to 1 in 2000. Currently, there are approximately 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day of the week and all across the country. If you think about that, that has a tremendous impact on how we do business. For example, if you'll take a look at Kmart or Sears, right now, to my knowledge, there are no Kmarts still open in the city of Springfield. They all closed. And Sears is kind of on life support right now. They have sold their Craftsman brand, and they have sold their Kenmore brand on appliances and so forth. So basically, those were the two most valuable trademarks that Sears had, and they have sold both of those off. So it would not surprise me if in the next 3 to 5 years, all of the Sears stores in the various malls don't close. And you see a lot of turnover, more turnover now than you used to see in shopping malls between some of the stores. And part of the problem is, not necessarily a problem, it's just part of the transition we're in, is that people are buying from Amazon.com, they are buying from eBay, they are buying through mail order where they could just have it shipped to their home, and they are not going out and shopping. And basically what's happening when they do go out and shop, they are using our big box stores, our Walmarts, our Kmarts, our Sears, our Macy's, as a display area where they go find what they want, maybe jot down the product number, then they go home and order the same thing off Amazon or eBay and get it cheaper than local. And so you've got any of your communities out there that are funded by a sales tax, a retail sales tax, such as Springfield, such as Ozark and Nixon, some of the other communities around Springfield. Every time you buy something from Amazon.com, your local community is missing out on that tax. Amazon is now collecting tax, but I believe that's only the state tax. I don't believe that comes on down to the local taxes or the CIDs that are around in the areas and so forth. So you've got this huge transition going on in how we do business. In continuing to look at the larger context, there's a slide there that says societal factors, and it's a quote by the Vice President of Human Resources where I used to work, 3M, and Kay said one time, employees leave supervisors, not employers. And employees today tend to be more concerned with their own needs, whether it be what they want out of work, their personal needs, their emotional needs, than ever before. It's kind of the influence of the me generation coming to work. And if you take a look at the next slide on the larger context, there's a chart there that I'd like to call your attention to as soon as Rishu gets us there. There you go. And this is a slide that I found just about a year ago, and it talks about why people change jobs. And if you notice, 75% of the workers who voluntarily left their jobs and basically felt like they were being honest in an exit interview indicated that they were leaving because of their bosses and not because of the position itself. As Kay said in the previous slide, people don't leave their employer, they leave their boss, so to speak. So if you think back to that, one of those early slides that I showed you where we talked about the fact that every organization is perfectly structured to get the results it does, if you have a high degree of turnover, it may be because of how that job is structured or how the management team is structured. And that may be part of it. Moving on into the local context, we talk about some of the legal and social factors. Hopefully everybody in the various rooms around the community that's watching this has heard of these particular laws that prohibit job discrimination. There's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, there's the Equal Pay Act, there's the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, Title I of Americans with Disabilities, Civil Rights Act of 1991. All of these are laws that if you're in a management position or supervisory position in your organization, you probably need to be aware of these laws. Secondly, there are things that are going on in society that, again, influence what you do in your workplace. There are a number of stories out there about harassment. If you think of the number of, starting with Bill Cosby and some of the folk, Matt Lauer and Bill O'Reilly, some of the folks, and the guy that's head of CBS, I think, there's Roger Ailes and Fox News. A number of people have lost their jobs, high-level jobs, because of complaints and allegations of harassment, retaliation, and so forth. And then you also have the issues of stereotyping and bullying. And if you're not familiar with these laws, they're at the top of the slide, as well as what's going on in our society about these other four things. You may be inadvertently putting your organization at risk. Now, I will tell you that I'm an unapologetic baby boomer. And one of the things that boomers do that absolutely drives millennials crazy is that we love to use quotations by people. And we have a quote for every situation. And this is one of my favorites. President Dwight Eisenhower, who was the general that was involved in our winning World War II and then became president for 8 years, has said that plans are of no particular value, but planning is indispensable. President Eisenhower was no fan of plans that just were written up, put in a binder, and set gathering dust on a shelf. However, he did know, and he proved, that continuous planning, just the process of going through that planning, would aid in the successful execution of whatever venture you were trying. That's how he helped win World War II. And a lot of people are not aware of this, but it was during his presidential terms that the interstate highway system was developed and built throughout the United States. The next two charts that we're going to see are probably the most valuable that we're going to discuss today, and I would encourage you to take them home and put them to use however you can within your organization. The first is called a strategic planning pathway, and this goes back to that quote by President Eisenhower, planning for your organization. What's nice about this particular chart is that you could use it for your overall organization, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a school system, whether it's a manufacturing organization, whatever it happened to be, whether it's a city government. You can sit down and use this as a pathway to develop a strategic plan. But the other thing that's nice about this is that if you happen to be in charge of a particular department, say you're in charge of the fabrication department in manufacturing, or you're in charge of the phlebotomy department in a hospital, or you're in charge of all the third grade teachers in your organization, this planning pathway will help you at the department level as well as at the larger organizational level. So let's just take a look at it for a minute. You start with the mission and values of your organization. Why are we even in business? What is our mission? Whether it's to make aluminum storm doors, whether it's to educate our children, whether it's to help people have dental health, whatever it happens to be, you need to find out and define fairly narrowly why your organization exists and what are the values within that organization. Then once you've done that, you will list some key objectives. Okay, this is what we're going to do. This is why we exist. Now, what are the objectives we need to meet in order to achieve that mission? Sorry, I had to take a drink of water there. Then once you have the key objectives listed, and it may be 2 or 3, it may be 12 to 15, whatever your key objectives are, then you sit down and take a look at each one and list the critical issues. What are the barriers? What are the problem areas that keep you from reaching those key objectives? And what you do is then, after you have those barriers or those critical issues listed, then you get everybody in a room and you just brainstorm. And when I say brainstorm, just shoot the moon on this one. Come up with the wildest ideas you can come up with in order to, in terms of how to correct some of those barriers or critical issues. You can always tone down a wild idea. You cannot liven up a dead idea. And so it's better to have your brainstorming, wild and crazy and written all over the wall so that you can then refine it down a little bit. And once you have those strategies refined, then you've got several questions you need to ask yourself. Number one, in order to achieve this strategy, which will take care of the critical issues, which will help achieve the key objectives, will additional training for our employees be required? Will training for our managers or our supervisors be required? Will our principals and superintendents need some additional training? What is required in there? Secondly, a question might be, is restructuring required? If you are turning out 800 widgets a day and 400 widgets are not shippable, not able to be used by the customer, you may need to do some restructuring and so forth. And then the question is there a capital expenditure required? Do you need to buy some new equipment? For example, if you're the U.S. Postal Service just recently, and I say recently, probably within the last 5 years, got the ability to track a package just like UPS and FedEx have been doing for decades, but the USPS Postal Service always lagged behind. And when they would come to 3M and say, we'd like to handle your shipping, our first question was, can you track it? And they would say no, and that would end the conversation right there, because the material that we made, we need to be able to track because of government regulations all the way from the time it left our dock until it arrived at the other end user. And so those are the questions that need to be asked of the strategies that you've developed. Then based on that, you develop a list of action items. Here's what we need to do to meet those strategies, to overcome those critical issues, to achieve the key objectives, and reaffirm why we are in business, why we are here. And once you've started those action items and have set up a timetable for those to be completed, you don't, like President Eisenhower said, you don't put it on the shelf and let the dust collect. You need to quarterly review and see how you're doing in terms of all those things you brainstormed and the action items you came up with. And this requires discipline within the organization. It's very easy to get sidetracked. It's very easy to start putting out fires and so forth. But the quarterly review and then the annual evaluation of how did we do, become increasingly important as you go down through there. And then always repeat this whole process again the next year. Make sure your mission hasn't changed. If you're a company that made buggy whips in 1898 and the automobile got invented, and all of a sudden in 1912, there's a declining market for buggy whips, your mission may need to change. You may need to be making belts or leather suspenders rather than buggy whips, something. That's why you go through this and repeat it, because we are in a volatile environment and things are changing out there. Okay, the next slide, and I would anticipate we'll have, when we get to the question and answer stage, I would anticipate we'll have some questions on that. Here is a hiring and retention system, and your HR system within your organization needs to be sound and trustworthy. And when I say an HR system, I'm not talking about necessarily an HR manager, supervisor, or somebody that's in charge of HR. It needs to be everybody that's involved in recruiting, involved in interviewing, involved in evaluation, involved in the hiring or the firing decision. All of those people make up an HR system. And so you have, coming down through the hiring retention system, you have recruiting, you're screening the applications to find the what appear to be the better candidates. You bring those in for an interview. During the interview and after you are assessing those people, decide who you want to make a job offer to. You make the job offer, you get the feedback from them, either they accept or they decline. Then you go, and generally that's a conditional job offer. The other feedback you need to get is, did they pass their drug screen? Did they pass their background check? Whatever it is your organization does. Then once they come in the very first day, you've got orientation. What does the company do? What's involved? What kind of paperwork do you have to have filled out? And then you begin the training for the job itself. And from then you talk about the total compensation. This may be an hourly rate. It may be an hourly rate with insurance benefits, or it may be an hourly rate where you get a discount if you buy whatever your organization is manufacturing, so forth. You get feedback from people. It may be a very casual feedback. It may be a more formal thing in terms of evaluations, where you find out people's relative satisfaction with, say, your compensation levels, with your benefit package, and so forth. And then you're also looking at coaching and training and continuing to add skills to those employees so they become more and more valuable to you. Going to move into a little bit different area. This is actually the legal part of it. Hopefully you all have been through some type of training dealing with harassment and so forth in the past, but we'll just kind of skim through this fairly rapidly. Earlier, you saw a slide that had a picture of 4 men, Pope Francis, President Trump, Governor Greitens, and presiding commissioner in Greene County, Bob Certain. 3 of those 4 have had to deal with sexual harassment issues within their world. Pope Francis is certainly dealing with the report that came out of Pennsylvania just recently in the last 2 to 3 weeks about 300 to 400 Catholic priests have been harassing children and adults, sexually harassing them, under the auspices, so to speak, of the church. Governor Greitens, who has recently resigned, had some allegations of harassment in there, as did, as we've heard from President Trump, some of his quotes and his tweets and so forth. I threw Bob Sturton in there simply because, not because he'd had any issues with sexual harassment, but he lost an election because of allegations that he used county money to help influence the tax election. And, so our environments, as I had said at the very beginning, are becoming more and more volatile, and victims are feeling safer in coming forward to voice complaints about harassment and discrimination. Social media is having a huge impact, and keep in mind that your organization, whatever it happens to be, is not immune from that. There are probably Facebook pages out there that are critical of your organization. You may not be aware of them, or you may be aware and track, but the idea is that it's a volatile situation and you have to be extremely careful. In terms of harassment and discrimination, the best way to stay out of trouble is simply to respect the dignity and worth of each individual. And I can't stress this enough. 19 states have legislation protecting sexual orientation and gender ID. 3 more states protect only sexual orientation. But I think you could see that over the last 10 years, you're almost a half of the states. We don't have anything on the federal books yet, but I would imagine that the states will continue to offer these protections moving forward. There are several categories of discrimination: age, disability, marital status, national origin, race and color, religion, gender, and sometimes sexual orientation. I say that sometimes because, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, 3 states protect that, gender ID, and there are a number of communities, actual cities around, that have passed local legislation that deals with gender identification. And those categories of discrimination that I read off are categories of discrimination when activities cause a hostile, intimidating, or offensive work environment, work performance is caused to suffer, job opportunities may be negatively affected, the person complaining is fired or demoted, and job status may be negatively affected. And that's when it becomes discrimination. There are a couple of special categories of discrimination. As Arishu tries to get there and catch up with me, you do fine. The special categories of discrimination are sexual harassment, and I predict that we will start seeing legislation either at a local level or a state level fairly quickly regarding bullying. Sexual harassment, these have been set aside as a special category. Sexual harassment is defined as the unwelcome sex-based behavior. It can be opposite sex behavior, male on female, female on male, or same-sex harassment, male to male or female to female. It can involve a quid pro quo, which is a Latin phrase for this, for that, and it simply means I will promote you if you, and you all could fill in the blank out there. And these days, most often, complaints and arguments will deal with a hostile or offensive work environment. And if we talk about what constitutes harassment, it could be verbal conduct, it could be nonverbal conduct, physical conduct, and visual conduct. And let's talk about those just for a moment. Verbal contact is pretty reasonable. I say something that you find grotesquely offensive. and that can constitute harassment. Nonverbal conduct, if I'm wearing a t-shirt to work and it is offensive or has some nastyism on it, that could be harassment as well. Physical conduct, if I come up and start rubbing your shoulders or something and you don't want that to happen, that is harassment. And visual conduct is a little more difficult to define and prove, but basically you walk up to somebody and you do that elevator eyes thing. You look them up and you look them down and so forth. That's the visual conduct. And a hostile work environment can involve all kinds of things, whether it be a calendar, whether it be the clothing, like I mentioned in the slide before, activities in the break room, somebody's reading a pornographic book or somebody tells a dirty joke out loud and other people hear it, stories in magazines that are around the workplace and so forth. And then the hostile work environment can also be religious conversation, sexually oriented conversation, somebody making fun of a disability. I wear 2 hearing aids, and back in high school, I would occasionally get called wooden ear because I didn't hear certain things, and you just have to be aware of that. National origin, race or color, sexual orientation, all of that can go to a hostile work environment. And a lot of people ask, why is this such a difficult situation or topic to handle? And simply, it's because of this. The crime is defined by the victim. Let's say I walk out to the parking lot, wherever you are, I've got a ball bat in my hand, and I proceed to break out your windshield. Now, I have committed a crime because I know before I ever walk out the door of the building and go to your car that I shouldn't break the windshield of your automobile. That crime has been defined by the legal folks, either the community or the state or the federal government. But with harassment, it's defined by the victim. Something you say to one person may not be harassment because they don't take it as offensive. But if you say the same thing to another person, that person may be offended, and at that point it becomes harassment. So again, probably the easiest way to deal with this is to continue to respect the dignity and worth of individuals. It's the perception of what you do and not necessarily what you actually do. For example, harassment doesn't have to be intentional to be illegal. The law only cares about what you did and how it was perceived by others. You know, you come along and pat somebody on the back, you know, they may perceive it one way. You pat them on somebody else on the back, they may perceive it as something entirely different, and it can become a harassment charge at that point. The law also only cares about what you said and how it was perceived by others. So again, it's a situation where the victim is defining the crime, and the best way to avoid that is just simply to stay away from that type of conversation, that type of activity. If there is a complaint filed, management has a responsibility, investigate allegations, document the results of the investigation. If it is warranted, take disciplinary action against the perpetrator and document that for future reference. Those are the requirements for management. And again, to sum up, the best way to prevent discrimination is to respect the dignity and worth of all individuals, not only in the workplace, but wherever you are, whether it's your church, whether it's shopping at Walmart or the mall or something. Just respect the dignity and worth of individuals, and that's the best way to prevent any charges. I want to throw this last slide in here, next to last slide, about just some studies that while I was preparing for this, I found out different studies. Female employees can be uncomfortable when PDA or public display of affection is common and not addressed by the staff. So if there's a lot of hugging, touching, and so forth going on, female employees can feel uncomfortable in that type of situation. They also tend to feel more comfortable when the population is closer to 50-50 in terms of male, female, as opposed to, say, 75 male, 3 female. When I first got into the HR field, the Springfield Personnel Association had 1 female member. That was in 1978. Now, in 2018, the Human Resources Association is about 75% female, 25% male. So you can see there has been a tremendous change in our society in terms of, women in the workforce. Many organizations have been successful incorporating harassment into their training activities. Part of their orientation, part of their training is to continue to hit on this issue of harassment. And then when harassment, teasing, and bullying are common, the culture of the organization is negative. And when the culture is negative, productivity suffers, whether it be education, whether it be medical, whether it be manufacturing, that whatever you're putting out, whatever your end result is, will be suffering. And I'd like to close with this quote by Ernest Hemingway. Again, I'm a baby boomer, got to have a quote for everything. But Ernest Hemingway one time said, "There's nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self." And I think that really is something we all ought to keep in mind as we try to chart these volatile waters that we're dealing with in the workplace. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rishu, and we'll take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. If I could invite all of our chamber members to start thinking about your questions. I'm hoping that every chamber at least has 1 or 2 questions. So if you don't have it, please think of 1 or 2, because we're blessed to have Bob here, and I want to make sure that we're getting some clarification. Bob, let me maybe throw 1 question at you just to get started. Maybe 2 questions. First is some of the examples you gave around misconduct. And you mentioned that intention doesn't really matter. It's the perception that's key. How do HR folks think about patterns of behavior? By that I mean, if there's an individual that sort of gives a colleague a pat on the back, and if there's not a pattern, and other individuals in the organizations don't see it as offensive, or maybe there's just not a pattern, and one particular individual sees it as an issue, how is that perceived through the legal eyes?
Well, that's where the investigation by the company comes in, because as I mentioned earlier, management has a responsibility to investigate any allegations that come forward. But that investigation is not just the alleged perpetrator and the victim. It is also the people around that perhaps witnessed this. And if you've got a situation where, 9 fellow workers are saying, he just walked up, patted her on the shoulder and said, "Good job," and went on, chances are that will be documented. And most companies have a progressive discipline plan, which starts with like a verbal warning, a written warning, suspension before termination. And they might provide or put into the employee file just a verbal warning documented that, this person complained about it. Everybody in the department didn't feel it was an issue. He has been counseled not to do this anymore. And then you go on. Then if you continue to get repeated complaints about that same employee, you're basically building the file and can move along that progressive discipline area.
Okay, good. All right, let me open it up. So let me maybe ask the folks in Aurora. Any questions that you'd like to raise for Bob? And you're unmuted, so you can speak up.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Rishu. I actually do personally have a question. For a lot of our chamber members are small businesses who do not have the luxury of having an entire HR department. Do you have any contacts, any information that you might be willing to share where that they could go online or anything like that to help with their HR, maybe discrimination, the harassment issues?
Yes, there are several websites they can go to. I can't think of them off the top of my head. I've seen them. And is this Shannon, by the way?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, hi there. What I'll do, Shannon, is when I get back home, I'll locate those and email them down to you so you can get them out to your members.
Okay, that would be wonderful. I think it would help a lot of the small businesses in our communities. So
Sure.
to have that, of course.
Right.
Ask Bob a carry-on question from what Shannon mentioned. Obviously, we have a lot of small, mid-sized businesses here. What's your recommendation to them? You covered a whole array of topics today, and then I can see some folks who are overwhelmed already with running their business day to day. What's a recommendation on one or two things that they could do in the next 4 weeks to just move this agenda forward even a few inches? What would you recommend?
I would recommend going to that strategic planning pathway and do the first 2 or 3 things on the cascade there. You know, if they truly haven't defined why they are in business, they need to do that, you know, and they need to do it in a way that all their employees can relate to, whether it be, you know, in the medical field, whether it be a physician, whether it be a nurse, anesthesiologist, a phlebotomist, right through the door here, our cafeteria workers, you know, custodians, whatever, that they can, you know, feel that they are a part of that organization. I would just start down that strategic planning pathway, and that will help get them started. And then that thing, as you get into it, it actually helps achieve its own momentum, because people generally like the place they work for. They want it to be a good place to work, and they want to feel involved in the decision making, and that's a great way to help.
So that a primer. So if you're going to make changes to HR policies or put in place any mitigation steps, if the employees are part of that decision-making process, then selling it to them would be easier. Makes sense. Okay. Thank you for that. Buffalo, any questions from you guys? Let me unmute you. Go ahead, Tanya.
Actually, if you could get that HR information to me as well, we'd appreciate that to share to our local businesses.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. In fact, I'll probably just send it to Rishu, and then he could forward it to everybody who is part of the webinar here.
All right, thank you. And I do have one question. On your statistics of the 75% of people leave their bosses and not their actual job, they like their job. Do you have any suggestions for bosses and managers of maybe or trainings that they can do to maybe help ease that and make it a better work environment?
Right. I think, you know, just like you continually train your employees to do a better job in making widgets or, you know, whatever it is they do, you need to also have some type of training program for the people in leadership positions. And it doesn't always have to be the supervisor. It might be a lead operator. It might be the head custodian, so to speak, you know, someone that has some responsibility, but they need to have some kind of training in how, basically, people relations, if you will, because that's really where the breakdown occurs, that they're treating people without respect and with very little dignity, and that's when people tend to walk away. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, are there any resources that you can think of for that kind of training?
Oh, sure. Missouri State has some non-credit courses in terms of supervisory. I think it's called the Management Development Institute, MDI, over at MSU. There'll be several others. Again, I'll research those and send them to Rishu so he can get them out to everybody.
All right, thank you.
Okay, great.
And I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. Salem, Tabitha, you guys are up. Let me see if I can unmute you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Rishi, we have one question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in regard to retention, what is your opinion about 360 reviews?
About what?
360.
360 reviews can be very valuable. You also find, you know, you're necessarily going to put a little more emphasis on the review from the people the person reports to than the people reporting to them. But it's certainly a very good way to find out any underlying problems that may be going on that you aren't aware of, that you haven't encountered. Nobody's come forward, but now in a anonymous, written down way where they don't have to come into HR, they don't have to come into the manager or whatever, you may find out something's going on that you had no idea was occurring out there. And that's where it really becomes valuable from that standpoint.
And last, certainly not the least, Marshfield, Casey, any thoughts from you? Let me see if I can unmute you. You are not unmuted. Casey, for some reason, I'm not able to unmute you. Can you try to see if you can unmute yourself?
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you. Sorry about that. The first slide was the one that really stuck out to me about every organization being perfectly structured to get the results it does. Do you have any suggestions on if your people within your organization are opposed to change or they're resistant against it? And I think that could come in with HR as well. Every organization knows HR is valuable, but then they have this resistance, like, ooh, that change. Do you have any suggestions on getting people on board with that?
Right. No, nobody likes change, and I understand that. That's why rather than just going forward and smacking and say, hey, we need to change, what you do is, like, for example, that strategic planning pathway that we went through, you know, if you kind of start working your way down through there, and then you come to the critical issues or the barriers and say, okay, how are we going to overcome this? It comes their idea on how to solve that problem, and then they are much more likely to accept the change than if you just came in and said, we're going to change this, and they're going, oh, no, we're not. You know, if it's their idea, it goes a lot smoother. And
Okay.
that's one of the advantages of having a template like that or a pathway, is that person kind of facilitating it can actually guide it a little bit if you're aware of problems that need to be addressed.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So we're just about ready to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time. Let me just take a moment to put a plug in for our next event. The next event will be on Thursday, October 18th. We have a wonderful speaker, thanks to the Salem team. The topic is 11 legal mistakes business owners make. So Michelle will be telling us some of her thoughts and perspectives on that front. Please join us for that event. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Bob. Thank you so much. You're a tremendous asset to the community. For all the chamber leaders and all the attendees, I just want to put a plug in for Bob. You guys have an incredible asset in Bob. He's got a ton of HR expertise. We'll send you his contact information. If you have any clarifying questions, or maybe if folks can pick your brain, they can reach out to you. Obviously, the talent issue is going to continue to be an issue. So please do utilize Bob as an asset. Take a moment to fill out the surveys. Chamber leaders, if you can send us scan those responses and send them back to us. And with that, we will pause. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Take care.